The mysterious signal. In the vast expanse of the universe, humanity had long looked to the stars with wonder and curiosity. Earth, a small blue planet, seemed insignificant in the grand scheme of the cosmos. But for one man, that insignificance would soon be shattered. His name was Jake Ryder, a former military officer turned freelance explorer. He had spent years charting the unknown regions of space, seeking adventure in the endless void. But nothing could have prepared him for what he would find. One quiet evening, as Jake sat in the cockpit of his starship, a strange signal flickered across his console. It was faint at first, a whisper in the cold silence of space, but then it grew stronger. This was no ordinary distress call. The transmission was filled with an urgency, a desperation that tugged at something deep inside him. It was unlike anything he'd ever heard. Intrigued and driven by a sense of duty, Jake set his ship's course to track the signal. Hours passed as he navigated through the dark stretches of space, following the mysterious beacon. As he neared the source, he saw the wreckage of a ship drifting through the void, its hull torn apart as though it had been caught in a violent battle. Jake's heart raced. This wasn't just a simple malfunction. The ship had been attacked. He boarded the derelict vessel with caution, his boots echoing on the metal floor as he made his way through the twisted corridors. The air was thick with the scent of burnt electronics, and sparks flickered from damaged wires. As he rounded a corner, he spotted something. Someone, lying unconscious amid the wreckage. It was a woman, but not like any human woman Jake had ever seen. Her skin was a deep shade of blue, her hair long and silver, and her features were sharp, almost otherworldly. Without hesitation, Jake rushed to her side. She was alive, barely, but alive. Her breathing was shallow, and her body was covered in bruises and burns. Jake carefully lifted her into his arms, his mind racing. Who was she? What had happened to her? And more importantly, why had she sent out a distress signal? As he carried her back to his ship, Jake couldn't help but feel a strange sense of responsibility for her. He had no idea who she was or where she came from, but he couldn't leave her to die in the cold void of space. Little did he know, this moment would mark the beginning of an extraordinary journey, one that would change the course of his life forever. A shattered world. As the days passed, Jake's ship Elysium continued its course through the black expanse of space, a sanctuary for Lyra as she recuperated. Her injuries, both physical and emotional, were deep, but as her body healed, so did a part of her soul. The woman from the Valar race was not just any survivor. She was the heir to an ancient legacy, and her survival meant something far greater than her own life. Jake had never truly understood the weight of her role until she began to open up. She explained the intricate history of the Valar, a species known not only for their technological advances, but also for their wisdom and unparalleled beauty. They were once an empire that spanned entire star systems, a race revered across the galaxy for their peacekeeping, scientific knowledge, and prosperity. But all that had changed with the rise of the Zerrin, a brutal, warmongering species that had swept through the galaxy like a scourge, destroying civilizations without mercy. The Zerrin had initially targeted the Valar for their vast resources, their advanced technology, and their growing influence. The Valar had been confident in their own power, believing themselves to be untouchable, but they underestimated the brutality of the Zerrin. It wasn't long before their cities were reduced to ashes, and the once proud empire fractured into desperate factions. The war had ravaged their people for decades, and Lyra's family had been forced into hiding, trying to maintain a fragile peace with their enemies. Lyra's mission had been to open negotiations with the Zerrin, an effort to broker a truce before the conflict could escalate further. But as she now explained, those negotiations had been a trap. The Zerrin ambushed her vessel in the dead of space, slaughtering her entire crew and leaving her stranded. The attack had been swift and brutal. They had spared her life only because they knew she was of royal blood. She was a pawn, a prize to be claimed, and they had hoped to use her to break the remaining resistance from the Valar. Jake listened in silence, his mind racing with the enormity of what she was telling him. He had always known that the galaxy was filled with dangers and struggles, but hearing about the destruction of an entire civilization, the loss of so many lives, struck a deep chord within him. And here, in front of him, was the last hope for the Valar. Lyra was not just a victim of war, she was the future. She was the symbol of hope for her people, and her survival meant that the Valar could rebuild, reclaim, and perhaps one day restore the balance to their broken world. As Lyra spoke, Jake couldn't help but feel a deep admiration for her. She was not just a princess, she was a leader in the truest sense. Her strength, despite the atrocities she had witnessed, was unwavering. But beneath that strength, Jake could see the vulnerability. She was not just carrying the burden of her people, she was carrying the weight of the future on her shoulders. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Jake asked one evening as he sat beside her in the quiet medical bay, watching her heal. Her silver hair shimmered in the soft light, and her violet eyes that spoke of ancient wisdom, met his. "I couldn't," Lyra replied softly, her voice filled with both sorrow and determination. "The Zeren are still hunting me. If they knew I was alive, they would stop at nothing to finish what they started. I needed to keep my true identity hidden, at least for a while. I didn't want to put you in danger." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had already seen what the Zeren were capable of. They were merciless, and if they knew a Valar princess was alive, they would send an entire fleet to track her down. The stakes had just gotten much higher. "Don't worry," Jake said, his voice firm. "I didn't take you in just to let you die. You're safe here, at least for now. I'll do everything I can to protect you." Lyra gave him a small, appreciative smile, though it was clear that her mind was still heavy with the fate of her people. She had known many allies in her time, but trust had become a rare commodity in the war-torn galaxy. The offer of help, of protection, meant more to her than words could express. But there was no time to rest. The Zeren were already on the move, and Jake knew they could not afford to stay in one place for too long. Every passing day brought them closer to the war they had hoped to avoid. They had to act, and they had to act fast. Jake spent the next several days analyzing the data Lyra had provided about the Zeren. She had managed to escape with a fragment of her ship's database, and it contained valuable intel about the Zeren's movements, their fleets, and their tactics. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them a fighting chance. They began to plot a course, choosing planets and stations that could offer safe harbor, places where they might find new allies in the fight against the Zeren. As they plotted their escape route, they began to understand just how fragile their position was. They weren't just running from the Zeren, they were running from an entire galaxy that had been consumed by war, where every corner seemed to hold enemies waiting to strike. But it wasn't all hopeless. As Lyra began to recover, she showed Jake something that filled him with a renewed sense of hope, a relic from her people's past. It was a small, delicate device, no larger than a pendant, but it held incredible power. It was a Valar artifact, capable of activating a hidden network of allies scattered across the galaxy, people who still believed in the old ways and the old promises of peace. It was their secret weapon, their chance to call upon the last vestiges of the Valar's influence. But it was not without risk. Activating the artifact would reveal their location to every faction in the galaxy, including the Zeren. But it was also their best hope of forming the alliance they so desperately needed. Jake made a decision. He was ready to take the risk. He had no choice. The only way forward was to confront the darkness head-on and hope that the light of their combined will could overcome it. The Elysium set course for the first location, a forgotten world on the edge of the galaxy, where the secrets of the past could ignite the fire of the future. They were not just running anymore. They were fighting for the very survival of a race, and for a hope that burned brightly within them both. The true journey was about to begin, and they would face whatever came their way, together. Unlikely allies. The Elysium sailed through the endless dark, its sleek form cutting through the void of space with purpose. Jake and Lyra spent the days ahead preparing for what was to come, each knowing the risks, each feeling the weight of the future pressing heavily on their shoulders. Lyra, though still recovering from her injuries, was slowly growing stronger, her sharp mind and royal resilience guiding their next steps. Jake, in turn, was determined to do whatever it took to help her rebuild her people and ensure their survival. They were not alone on their journey. As they ventured deeper into the fringes of known space, they encountered others. Refugees from other planets, mercenaries, and renegades who had escaped the cruelty of the Zerrin. Each of these groups had their own stories of survival, of being torn from their homes, their families, and their lives by the merciless Zerrin regime. But despite the scars they carried, there was a common thread binding them all: an overwhelming desire to fight back, to take a stand, to be free. One such group was a small band of rebels who called themselves the Starborn. They had been waging a guerrilla war against the Zerrin for years, targeting their supply routes, disrupting communications, and causing havoc wherever they could. Their leader, a grizzled veteran named Captain Eris, had fought in countless battles, and though his exterior was rough, his heart was fierce and unwavering. It was during a covert operation to intercept a Zerrin convoy that Jake and Lyra first met Captain Eris. The mission had been dangerous, but it had yielded valuable intel about the Zerrin's movements. Captain Eris, having heard of the Veilers' plight through whispers in the galaxy's underworld, was hesitant to trust Jake and Lyra at first. There was too much at stake, and alliances in a war like this were fraught with danger. "You're telling me that you have a Veiler princess on your ship?" Captain Eris asked, his gruff voice laced with skepticism. He stood in the command center of the Elysium, arms crossed, eyeing Lyra with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "I don't know what game you're playing, but if you're hoping to use the Veiler name to unite the galaxy, you're going to need more than that." Lyra stood tall, her regal bearing and determination palpable, even in this rough corner of space. Her violet eyes met his without flinching. "I'm not asking you to trust me because of my bloodline. I'm asking you to trust me because we have a shared enemy, the Zerrin. I can help you, Captain. Together, we can defeat them." Captain Eris was silent for a long moment, weighing the decision. There were few he trusted, but he had seen firsthand the devastation the Zerrin could unleash. The idea of uniting against them, with the might of the Veiler behind them, was tempting. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here. But Lyra's words rang true. The galaxy needed hope, and the Veiler, despite their fall, could still provide that spark. "We'll work with you," he finally said, his voice steady. "But you better not expect any special treatment, Princess. You've got a long road ahead of you, and you're going to have to earn every bit of trust." Jake, who had been watching the exchange quietly, stepped forward. "We're not asking for anything more than a chance. The Zerrin are coming for all of us. If we don't unite now, there won't be any galaxy left to fight for." Eris nodded, his expression hardening with the weight of their situation. "All right, I'll get my people on board, but know this, we fight on our terms, and I won't go down without a fight." And just like that, an alliance was born. The Starborn became their first true ally, and with them, they began to form a network of resistance groups across the galaxy. Lyra, now fully understanding the magnitude of her role, worked tirelessly to strengthen their coalition. She used the relic from her people, activating the hidden Veiler network, sending out signals that reached distant corners of space. The response was overwhelming. Old allies, hidden factions, and even long-forgotten allies from ancient times began to rally to their cause. The alliance wasn't without its challenges. Tensions ran high, and each group had its own methods, priorities, and ways of doing things. The Veiler, proud and regal, had their own traditions and protocols, while the Starborn had grown accustomed to their independent, no-nonsense approach. But as they spent more time together, a mutual respect began to form. Lyra's wisdom and grace helped bridge the divides, while Jake's leadership, honed from years of military experience, proved invaluable in organizing and uniting the disparate factions. Yet, the Zeren were relentless. They had caught wind of the growing resistance and had begun to target the star systems that housed the Alliance's newfound strongholds. Their fleets were larger, faster, and more destructive than anything Jake and his allies had ever faced. The Zeren's tactics were merciless, decimating entire planets, leaving nothing behind but ash and ruin. Jake and Lyra knew that the time for small skirmishes was over. The resistance had grown strong enough to mount a full-scale offensive. It would be a desperate gamble, a risk that could either ensure their victory or lead to their ultimate destruction. But the stakes had never been higher, and the price of inaction was far too great. It was during a heated strategy session that the Alliance's resolve was truly tested. The Zeren had launched an attack on a key resistance base located on a remote planet, and the Starborn were preparing to launch a counterattack. But the odds were stacked against them. The Zeren had brought a fleet far larger than anything the rebels could handle. Lyra, standing at the head of the room, her regal presence commanding the attention of every leader, spoke with authority. "We cannot win this battle if we fight like we always have," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "We need to outsmart them. We need to strike where they least expect it. I have an idea, one that will cost us everything if it fails, but if it works, it will give us the advantage we need." Jake stood by her side, his heart pounding. He knew this was their only chance, but it came with incredible risk. Lyra had devised a plan to infiltrate the Zeren's flagship, a massive warship that was the heart of their fleet. The plan was audacious, but if they could disable it, the Zeren's command structure would collapse, and the rest of their fleet would be thrown into disarray. There was no turning back now. The Alliance rallied behind Lyra's leadership, and they prepared for the most dangerous mission of their lives. Each of them knew that the outcome of this battle would shape the fate of the galaxy. But in the quiet moments before the battle, as the stars stretched out before them, Jake couldn't help but think of how far they had come. From the moment he had found Lyra stranded on that wrecked ship to now, leading a coalition of rebels, mercenaries, and freedom fighters against one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy. The galaxy was a vast, unforgiving place, but it was also filled with untapped strength and hope, and that hope was embodied in every person who stood by Lyra's side. As the Elysium prepared to jump into hyperspace, Jake knew one thing for certain. No matter the outcome, they had already won something far greater than a single battle. They had won the chance to fight, to survive, and to dream of a future where they could live free from the shadow of tyranny. The battle for freedom. The plan was set. The Alliance had grown stronger with each passing day, but now the time had come to take the fight directly to the Zeren. The stakes could not have been higher. They were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for freedom. The freedom of their people, their planets, and their galaxy. The Zeren had long held the galaxy in their cruel grip, and now, the tide was finally turning. The question remained, would the united front of the resistance be enough to tip the scales in their favor? The night before the battle, the Alliance gathered in the command center of the Elysium. The War Council was tense. The maps and holograms flickered in the dim light, displaying a plan so daring it felt like a suicide mission. But they had no other choice. If they did not succeed in taking down the Zeren flagship, the Alliance would be shattered, and the galaxy's hope for liberation would die with it. Lyra, standing at the head of the table, addressed the gathered leaders. Her voice was calm, but there was a fire in her eyes. The Valar princess had transformed into a true leader, commanding not only respect, but the unwavering loyalty of those who fought alongside her. "This battle will not be easy," she said, her tone unyielding. "We're facing the most powerful fleet in the galaxy, but we have one advantage. We fight for something greater than ourselves. Our resolve, our unity will carry us through." Jake, who had become not just her protector, but her closest ally, stood beside her. He could see the strain in her eyes, the weight of responsibility that had taken root in her heart. She had given everything to this cause, and now there was no turning back. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've come this far, Lyra. We're not stopping now. We're in this together." Her eyes met his with a mix of gratitude and determination. She knew that he was right. This wasn't just about defeating the Zeren. It was about reclaiming their future. It was about creating a galaxy where no one had to live in fear, where everyone had the chance to live free from tyranny. As the hours passed, the preparations continued. The Starborn, led by Captain Eris, would be responsible for launching a diversionary attack on the Zeren's forward ships, drawing their attention away from the true target, the Zeren flagship. Meanwhile, a small team of elite soldiers from the Alliance, including Jake and Lyra, would infiltrate the flagship, sabotage its systems, and take out the command center. If they could disable the flagship, it would cripple the entire Zeren fleet and disrupt their chain of command. The team was small but skilled, each member chosen for their specific talents. There was Commander Rael, a former Zeren officer who had defected to the Resistance after seeing the cruelty of his own people. He knew the Zeren's tactics inside and out and was the perfect person to guide them through the flagship's defenses. There was Nyx, a stealth operative with a knack for infiltration, and Rook, a sharpshooter whose precision with a blaster rifle was unmatched. Together, they would be the spearhead of the assault. Jake and Lyra, though aware of the dangers, knew this was the only chance they had. They would fight side by side, not just for victory, but for each other. The bond they had forged in the fires of war had become unbreakable, and now, in the face of their greatest challenge, they were more than allies. They were partners in the truest sense of the word. As the Elysium made its way toward the Zeren fleet, the tension in the air was palpable. The ship's crew worked with swift precision, readying their weapons, checking systems, and preparing for the worst. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this could be their last mission, but he pushed the thought aside. There was no time for fear. There was only the fight ahead. When the battle began, it was nothing short of chaos. The Zeren flagship loomed large in the distance, a dark monolith of destruction, while the rest of the fleet moved in formation around it. The Starborn launched their attack with everything they had, using every trick in their arsenal to distract and confuse the Zeren forces. Explosions rang out in the distance as laser fire and plasma weapons lit up the blackness of space. It was a dazzling, terrifying display, and the Zeren took the bait, focusing their fire on the diversionary forces. Inside the Elysium, Jake and Lyra suited up for the mission. The adrenaline coursing through Jake's veins made his movements feel sharp and precise. He glanced at Lyra, who, despite the enormity of the situation, looked poised, ready to lead. It was clear that she had fully embraced her role as the future of the Valar. She was no longer just a princess. She was a symbol of hope, a beacon of resistance. Together, with their team, they launched from the Elysium in a stealth shuttle, weaving through the chaos of the battle and heading straight for the heart of the Zeren fleet. The shuttle's cloaking technology made them invisible to the enemy, but the closer they got to the flagship, the more intense the security measures became. Armed sentries patrolled every corner, and security drones scanned the area. But with Commander Rael's guidance and Nyx's stealth, they managed to slip past undetected. The Zeren flagship's interior was a labyrinth of cold metal and harsh lighting, a place built for war and conquest, not peace. The team moved quickly through the corridors, taking out guards silently and making their way toward the core systems. They knew that time was running out. The Zeren fleet was still in the midst of fighting off the Starborn, but they would soon realize the true target of the Resistance's assault. The deeper they went, the more intense the resistance became. They encountered heavily armored Zeren soldiers, elite guards whose sole purpose was to protect the flagship's command center. Each encounter was a brutal exchange of fire, with Rook picking off enemies from a distance while Jake and Rael led the charge. Lyra, though not a soldier by trade, proved her worth in every engagement, using her agility and sharp instincts to stay one step ahead of their enemies. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the heart of the flagship, the command center. The doors were reinforced, and the security systems were some of the most advanced in the galaxy. But Rael knew exactly what to do. With a few quick commands, he hacked into the systems, disabling the security protocols and allowing them access. Inside, the command center was chaos. The Zarin officers had realized something was wrong, and they were scrambling to take control of their flagship. But it was too late. Lyra and Jake, leading the charge, stormed into the room, weapons drawn and ready. The Zarin officers looked up, surprised, but they quickly regained their composure and drew their own weapons. The battle inside the command center was fierce, but it was clear that the resistance had the upper hand. Lyra's presence was a beacon of hope to the troops, and the sight of her leading the charge sent a ripple of determination through their ranks. They were fighting for something greater than themselves, and that belief gave them the strength they needed to prevail. With one final push, they overwhelmed the Zarin forces, and the command center fell silent. The flagship was theirs. But the battle was far from over. The Zarin fleet was still out there, and they would stop at nothing to take back what they had lost. The resistance had struck a powerful blow, but the war was only just beginning. A galaxy reborn. The silence that followed the battle in the command center of the Zarin flagship was deafening. The once chaotic hum of machinery and the crackle of energy weapons now felt distant, almost surreal. Lyra stood amidst the wreckage of the Zarin officers, her breathing steady but filled with a quiet, almost solemn energy. The destruction of the flagship had crippled the Zarin's command structure, but as the dust settled, it became clear that this victory was but a single chapter in a much larger war. The Zarin would retaliate with everything they had. They were a ruthless, relentless force, and they would not easily let go of their hold on the galaxy. Jake, still catching his breath from the fight, looked around at the team. Commander Rael, now reunited with his people, was in the process of assessing the damage to the flagship's systems. Nix, ever the quiet operative, scanned the room, ensuring there were no hidden threats lurking in the shadows. Rook, his blaster rifle slung across his back, gave Lyra an approving nod, though he knew the battle wasn't truly over. Lyra stepped forward, her gaze moving across the team, her eyes steely with purpose. We've dealt a heavy blow to the Zarin, but we cannot rest. They will rebuild, they will come for us again, and they will not hesitate to destroy everything in their path. Her voice, though soft, rang with the undeniable conviction of a leader who had seen the horrors of war firsthand. We must use this victory to galvanize the galaxy. We must prove to the people that the Zarin can be defeated. We must show them that freedom is within our reach. Jake stepped to her side, his voice low but filled with determination. We have the power to change the course of this war. This flagship, this symbol of oppression, will serve as a rallying point for the resistance. It's time to take our fight to the stars. Lyra, it's time for the galaxy to unite under the banner of freedom. Lyra turned to him, meeting his gaze. Yes, she said, a spark of fierce determination lighting up her violet eyes. It's time to reclaim the galaxy. For the Valar. For all of us. They spent the next few hours securing the flagship, rerouting its power systems, and using the Zarin's own technology to turn it into a base of operations for the Alliance. The massive warship, once a symbol of oppression and destruction, had now become a symbol of hope, a beacon for all those who fought for a future free of tyranny. The Zarin's advanced weapon systems, previously used to crush resistance, would now be used to defend the innocent and liberate the oppressed. The Elysium and the newly acquired Zarin flagship worked in tandem, ferrying refugees and resistance fighters from the front lines to safety. The Alliance's numbers were growing rapidly, and the resistance was no longer just a scattered group of outcasts and rebels. It had become an organized, formidable force. News of the victory spread like wildfire across the galaxy, reaching even the most remote worlds, where people had lived in fear of the Zarin for decades. But even as the Alliance grew stronger, the threat of retaliation loomed large. The Zeren were not just a military power, they were a force of nature, driven by their unyielding desire for domination. They had vast resources, an unrelenting will to conquer, and a deep-seated hatred for those who resisted their rule. The victory at the Zeren flagship had given the galaxy a taste of hope, but it had also drawn the attention of the Zeren High Command. The next few weeks were spent in a tense state of preparation. Jake and Lyra, along with their allies, knew that a full-scale counteroffensive from the Zeren was inevitable. They had no illusions about the scale of the war they were now embroiled in. The fate of the galaxy rested on the strength of their alliances, the courage of their fighters, and the strategic brilliance of their leaders. In the midst of these preparations, Lyra found herself struggling with something she hadn't expected: the weight of leadership. She had always been a princess, sheltered by the traditions of her people. But now, she was a queen, a leader of a resistance, and the burden of guiding these broken factions into a unified front weighed heavily on her shoulders. The pressure was unrelenting, and there were days when the fear of failure threatened to drown her. One evening, as the stars stretched out before them and the Elysium sailed through the emptiness of space, Jake found her standing alone on the observation deck, gazing out at the vast expanse. He knew what was on her mind. The weight of their mission, of their cause, was something neither of them could escape. "You're doing more than anyone could have asked for," Jake said, approaching her from behind. His voice was soft, yet firm with a conviction that matched hers. "You've brought together people who were scattered, broken, and uncertain. You've given them hope. That's something no one else could have done." Lyra didn't turn to face him, but he could see her shoulders relax ever so slightly. "I don't feel like I've done enough," she admitted quietly. "There's still so much to be done. So many lives at stake. If I make the wrong decision, if I fail." Jake stepped beside her, his gaze following hers as they both stared out at the stars. "Then you fight. You keep fighting, because that's who you are, Lyra. You've already given everything. And that's what makes you a leader. You don't give up." She met his eyes, a flicker of gratitude in her expression. "I've never had someone believe in me like you do." Jake smiled softly. "Because I know you, I've seen your strength, and I believe in this, believe in us." He paused, his voice growing a little quieter. "We've come too far to stop now. The galaxy is on the brink of change, and we're the ones leading it. We've got this." Lyra's eyes softened, the weight of her doubts momentarily lifted. The world outside seemed just a little less dark, the stars a little brighter. She knew the road ahead would be filled with more trials and more sacrifices. But with Jake at her side, with the alliance growing stronger every day, she felt something stir within her, a renewed sense of purpose. In that moment, Lyra realized that the galaxy's fight for freedom was not just about defeating the Zeren. It was about creating something new, something better. And it would take every ounce of their strength, every bit of their ingenuity, and every spark of hope to bring that future into being. The final battle was drawing nearer, but now, with the strength of the alliance behind them, Lyra and Jake were ready to face it. The galaxy would not fall to the Zeren, not while there was still hope. And together, they would fight to the very end. The shifting tide of war. The Elysium glided through the stars with the Zeren flagship in tow, now converted into the new heart of the growing resistance. The hum of its engines and the steady rhythm of life aboard the massive ship felt like a constant reminder of just how much was at stake. Every corner of the flagship was alive with activity as the newly formed alliance worked tirelessly to prepare for the coming storm. The galaxy, once a fractured collection of planets, was beginning to unite. But it wasn't the unity of peace, it was the unity of a people determined to reclaim their freedom. Lyra stood on the bridge of the flagship, her hands clasped behind her back, staring out at the dark vastness of space. The battle had given her a renewed sense of purpose, but it had also awakened a deeper, more solemn understanding of the cost of what lay ahead. They had crippled the Zeren's command structure, but that victory had only emboldened them. The retaliation would come, and the Zeren would bring all of their military might to bear. Beside her, Jake studied the tactical displays, his brow furrowed in concentration. He knew the Zeren wouldn't be defeated easily. Their retaliation would be swift, and they would target any weak point in the alliance. The key, Jake realized, was not only surviving the coming conflict, but also taking the fight to the Zeren in a way they had never expected. "We have to hit them hard, fast, and decisively," Jake said, his voice breaking through the stillness. "We can't wait for them to regroup. We need to strike at their supply lines, their hidden bases, and their reinforcements before they can organize a counteroffensive." Lyra turned to him, her violet eyes sharp with understanding. "I agree. The Zeren rely on their supply chain to sustain their fleet. If we can sever their logistical support, we weaken them significantly." She took a deep breath, her shoulders squared. "But we need to move quickly. The longer we wait, the more time they have to regroup and retaliate." Jake nodded. He understood the urgency. The Alliance's resources were limited, and the longer they remained on the defensive, the more vulnerable they became. The Zeren were a relentless force, and they would stop at nothing to crush any resistance that dared to stand against them. Jake had seen firsthand the devastation the Zeren were capable of. The battle for freedom wasn't just about military victories. It was about outsmarting a brutal, unforgiving enemy. In the days that followed, the Alliance launched a series of covert operations across the galaxy. Each mission was a calculated risk, hitting Zeren supply ships, sabotaging their weapons manufacturing plants, and liberating key planets that had fallen under their control. Lyra and Jake worked side by side, their roles complementing each other perfectly. Lyra's strategic insight, honed by her royal training and the wisdom of her people, was invaluable, while Jake's military expertise guided their forces through the intricacies of guerrilla warfare. But even as their successes mounted, they knew the storm was coming. The Zeren High Command had been silent, biding their time, preparing their retaliation, and when it came, it was unlike anything the Resistance had anticipated. The first wave of the Zeren counteroffensive came without warning. It wasn't a massive fleet. No, the Zeren were smarter than that. Instead, they launched a series of surgical strikes on the Resistance's weakest points. Small fleets, expertly maneuvered and supported by highly trained shock troops, struck at the heart of the Alliance's supply bases, catching them off guard. They used new technologies, cloaking devices, and pulse disruptors that rendered their ships nearly invisible on radar, making them difficult to track. Jake and Lyra had been expecting an attack, but the sheer speed and precision of the Zeren's moves caught them off balance. The Resistance's scattered forces were forced to retreat, scrambling to defend their positions. The Elysium barely escaped the initial assault, its shields glowing bright as the ship darted between the burning remnants of destroyed Resistance fleets. The Zeren were taking no prisoners. Inside the command center, chaos erupted. The holographic displays flashed with alerts, warning of the Zeren's relentless assault. But amidst the confusion, Lyra stood still, her gaze locked on the battle plans unfolding before her. She was no longer the young princess who had fled from her people's destruction. She was a queen, an unyielding force of nature, and she had learned from the past. "Hold steady," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "We will not falter. This is our moment. If we hold fast, we can still win this." Jake met her eyes, his own filled with unwavering resolve. He knew this was the moment that would define their resistance. The Zeren had made their move, but it was not the end. It was just another challenge to be overcome. Together, they had come so far, and they would not be cowed by the enemy. Within hours, Lyra had a counterplan in motion. She gathered the remaining leaders of the Alliance, mercenaries, rebels, former soldiers, and laid out her strategy. It was daring, risky, and would require them to stretch their resources thin, but it was their best shot at survival. "We fight back by being unpredictable," Lyra said, her eyes alight with the fire of leadership. The Zeren think they can anticipate our every move, but they're wrong. We'll move faster, we'll strike harder, and we'll keep them guessing. We'll be a force they can't counter. Jake, ever the pragmatist, gave her a nod of approval. We'll hit them where it hurts. Their supply chains, their communication networks, their leadership. We'll make them bleed. The Alliance began a rapid series of offensives, using the Zeren's overconfidence against them. They struck where the Zeren least expected it: hidden bases, undefended routes, and isolated planets that had been left vulnerable in the wake of their initial assault. Every mission was executed with precision, every move calculated to disrupt the Zeren's growing momentum. For weeks, the galaxy shook as the war intensified. Entire star systems that had been under Zeren rule for decades were liberated in a single devastating blow. The resistance had begun to claw back the ground they had lost, and with each victory, the Zeren's hold on the galaxy began to weaken. The Alliance was no longer a scattered force of desperate survivors. It had become an army, a true fighting force capable of going toe-to-toe with the mighty Zeren. Yet, as they fought, the question remained: how long could they keep it up? The Zeren, though wounded, were not a defeated enemy. Their leaders were ruthless, and their technology was unmatched. If the resistance was to succeed, they would need to find a way to destroy the heart of the Zeren war machine. Lyra's next move would take them into the very heart of enemy territory, an assault on the Zeren homeworld itself. But such an undertaking would require the full might of their alliance, and the stakes had never been higher. The Zeren's empire had held for centuries, but now it was on the verge of collapse. The final battle was approaching, and everything would be decided by their ability to overcome the odds. The galaxy's fate rested in the hands of those who dared to fight for it, and as Jake and Lyra stood together, their resolve unwavering, they knew one thing for certain: they would fight until the very end. Because in this war, there was no turning back. The heart of the storm. The final battle was drawing near, and the weight of the moment pressed down on every soul in the Alliance. It had taken everything to get to this point: sacrifices, countless battles, the deaths of comrades, and the loss of worlds that would never be reclaimed. The Zeren had ruled with cruelty and brutality for far too long, and now Lyra and Jake, along with their growing coalition of rebel forces, were preparing to strike at the very heart of their empire. The plan was audacious, almost reckless. The Zeren homeworld was heavily fortified, surrounded by an impenetrable defense grid. Their fleets were larger and more advanced than anything the Alliance had ever encountered, and their planetary defenses were seemingly invincible. But the Alliance had come to realize one truth: when you fight a monster, you cannot expect to win by playing by its rules. They had to outthink the Zeren, and in this final hour, they had to strike with a force unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. Lyra, standing in the command center of the flagship, studied the holographic map of the Zeren homeworld. Her mind raced through every possible strategy, every outcome. The galaxy was on the brink of something monumental, and she would not let it slip away. She could feel the eyes of her people upon her, the expectations heavy in the air. This wasn't just about defeating the Zeren. It was about forging a new future for every being in the galaxy, a future where peace could once again take root. Jake, ever the pragmatist, stood beside her, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning the data that flickered before them. The final assault would involve a direct strike on the heart of the Zeren capital, a highly fortified city that housed their leaders and military command. To make it even more complex, the Zeren had been rebuilding their forces at an alarming rate, and they knew the resistance was coming. "We'll need every advantage we can get," Jake said, breaking the silence. "We've been hitting their supply chains and weakening their fleets, but they'll throw everything they have at us. We can't afford to make any mistakes." Lyra nodded, her mind focused, her voice calm yet resolute. "We won't. We've come too far to falter now. The galaxy believes in us. We're not just fighting for survival anymore, Jake. We're fighting for something greater." As the Alliance's forces prepared for the final push, the fleet set course for the Zeren homeworld, a distant star system surrounded by dark nebulas and the remnants of dead stars. The journey would take days, and during those days, the weight of their decisions seemed to settle deeper into the hearts of all those who stood with them. The crew aboard the Elysium was silent but determined. Their faces, weathered by countless battles, were filled with resolve. They had fought together, built together, and sacrificed more than any of them could count. Now, as they neared the heart of the Zaran Empire, their focus had sharpened. There would be no turning back from this. The final assault would come in two phases. First, the Alliance would send a decoy fleet to distract the Zaran forces, small, swift, and seemingly vulnerable ships designed to draw attention away from the real threat. Meanwhile, the bulk of the fleet, including the Elysium and the newly commandeered Zaran flagship, would make a stealth approach to the planet. There, they would launch a surprise strike at the Zaran's planetary defense systems, disabling their shields and allowing the rest of the fleet to land on the surface. It was a daring plan, one that relied heavily on the Zaran's arrogance. They believed their defenses were impenetrable and that the resistance was no match for them. But that belief had already cost them once, and it would cost them again. As the decoy fleet launched its assault, the tension in the air was thick. Jake and Lyra were on the bridge of the Elysium, watching as the decoy ships engaged the Zaran's outer defenses. The battle erupted almost immediately. The decoy fleet fired on the Zaran ships, luring them further away from the real threat. The sound of explosions and the flicker of energy beams filled the void as the decoy ships fought valiantly, knowing full well that they were nothing more than a distraction. Every lost ship was a painful reminder of the sacrifices that had been made, but there was no room for hesitation. They had all volunteered for this. Meanwhile, the Elysium and the main fleet moved silently through the dark void, taking advantage of the cover provided by the surrounding nebulas. Lyra's mind was clear as she focused on the mission ahead, her determination unwavering. She had led them to this moment. Now it was time to finish what they had started. As they neared the Zaran capital, the final phase of their plan began. The Elysium and its allies broke through the nebula's cover, emerging directly above the planet's primary defense grid. It was here that Lyra made her move, launching a series of targeted strikes designed to disable the planet's shielding systems. The Zaran were slow to react, and in that precious moment, the Alliance had the upper hand. But just as victory seemed within reach, the Zaran retaliated. Their forces, hidden in the shadows of the planet, surged forward with unrelenting force. The Resistance's fleet was surrounded on all sides, and the skies above the capital became a storm of fire and chaos. Laser blasts filled the air, and the ground beneath them shook as enemy ships descended. Lyra and Jake stood side by side, watching as their ships engaged in the fiercest battle they had ever faced. The Zaran's final stand had arrived, and they were throwing everything they had into this one last attempt to crush the Alliance. The Resistance fleet fought back with everything they had, but the sheer force of the Zaran's counterattack was overwhelming. "We can't hold out much longer," one of the fleet commanders called from the bridge. Lyra's eyes remained fixed on the battlefield. She knew they had to keep fighting, to push through the storm. The key to victory was getting to the heart of the Zaran command, where the leaders of the Empire were holed up. If they could strike there, they would break the enemy's resolve once and for all. "Jake," Lyra said, her voice sharp, "we're going in. We're taking the capital." Jake met her eyes, understanding the gravity of her words. "I'm with you." With that, the Elysium dove into the heart of the chaos. They broke through the Zaran lines, their ships crashing through enemy defenses with unstoppable force. The final assault was brutal, every second filled with the roar of energy blasts and the sound of ships disintegrating. But Lyra, Jake, and the remaining fighters pressed on, relentless in their pursuit. As they approached the heart of the Zaran capital, the true battle began. The final confrontation, where everything would be decided in a clash of wills and weapons. Victory or defeat, the galaxy would remember this day for centuries to come. The fate of the universe hung in the balance, and the final chapter of this war was about to be written.